Good morning, professional accounting students of Rutgers University. My name is Dr. Christopher Young, and I will be your professor for the next 4 lectures. Before we begin the course, let's begin by looking at the syllabus for spring of 2018. This course is a 1-credit MBA course. It's an adaptation of our 1-credit business ethics course for the non-professional accounting students MBA program. Your course is a little different than the full-time and part-time non-professional MBA programs, for the simple reason that we focus in your 4-week lecture series not just on ethics and ethical decision making, but we also focus on the professional responsibility of the financial services professional more broadly and the accountant more specifically. This is the first of 4 lectures. I estimate that the total time for each lecture, or in total, will be approximately 8 hours for your 1 credit. We'll get into the specifics in a second of how your marks will develop and grades provided. So let's just get some of the basic things out of the way. During the week or after syllabus, you can call me at the office, email me, or attend office hours. It is important to note that my office is in New Brunswick and that most of you are in Newark. Most likely, the chances of you coming to New Brunswick to speak is improbable. That said, I will make myself available to you when necessary or by appointment. Just shoot me an email prior to your wanting to talk. The syllabus outlines what's required of the course, but let me just break it down for you in a second or two. The course is going to first discuss or help you understand how to make decisions using an ethical framework. These decision-making tools are to be coupled with your other tools you've learned in your corporate finance course, your management accounting course, your organizational behavior course, etc., etc. The second part, or the second lecture, will focus on ethical systems, and the last 2 lectures will focus on professional responsibility. This is the first time I am teaching this course with professional responsibility as a main focus, and specifically the AICPA. I have not provided you readings for the last week just yet, but I will over the next coming days. So up on your screen you should see the syllabus, and I want to tell you a little bit about how I will provide to you the lectures. Each Friday or Saturday being the latest, I will upload to Blackboard a lecture. My goal, although I cannot promise to you this yet, is that I will have all 4 lectures up sooner rather than later. But it's up to you in the professional accounting program to squeeze this lecture in whenever possible. For those of you that do not know, I did my MBA at Rutgers University in the professional accounting program with many of the same professors as you. And I know how challenging it can be to take courses, specifically one-credit courses, online, and how tedious are the level of discipline you need to make sure you get to them. So I urge you to fit it in whenever possible. I understand that this is a challenging program to be done in 14 to 16 months if my memory serves correctly. But I am going to plea to you over the next couple of weeks that this course and the basic understandings or the basic learnings are extremely important to your career and to your professional development. If only I spent more time earlier in my career in thinking about business ethics and professional responsibility, it is my belief that my career would have progressed even further and faster. It is also my belief that we are taught in most business schools half-truths. And what do I mean by that? Many schools of thought focus on financial decision-making. Most business schools, most corporations, when analyzing a no or no-go decision, binary, to do or not to do, most often they focus exclusively on things such as IRR, or internal rate of return, net present value, payback period, and the list goes on, as you all know. But what we forget to think about in postmodern education is the fact that most of the people who have brought us the tools such as IRR and net present value and concepts such as utility and utility maximization theory and the idea of shareholder value also discussed the other side of the decision making that relates to ethics. People such as Adam Smith or folks like Milton Friedman or other big names in the accounting, economics, and financial areas have all discussed in one way or another the ethics of decision making. And it is my point here to just let you know that we have to think about ethics and the decision-making principles of ethics in the same way we look at decision-making under uncertainty using financial metrics. More about that later. So let's get back to the course. There's going to be 4 lectures. I am not going to test you on the lectures. The lectures are all on you. Your grading is going to be 100% earmarked to a case analysis where each one of you will have 1 day or so to complete an online case which I will provide to you. This case will be from the Yale School of Management, Harvard Business Cases, Ivy cases, or perhaps one I make up on my own. I will provide this to you at a later date, but this will be due to me by February 18th. Each of you will provide a response, again with details, much more details to be provided later. Each of you will provide me a response of approximately 6 pages. Again, more to come. So what are the learning goals of the course? Well, the first learning goal of the course is ethical judgment. How do I make ethical decisions? How do I critically evaluate unstructured business scenarios and develop innovative and ethical decisions? How do I recognize ethical dilemmas and identify the tools needed to solve those dilemmas? Number two, global perspective learning. Although it's my intent to talk about the global setting, it's challenging to get in a substantial portion of this in a 4-lecture series, but I will try my best. Number 3, effective communication learning goal. It is going to be very important for you when you get to the case competition and when I provide you the overview of what your requirements are. But once again, I'm going to urge you to not only think about the ethical decision making, but also how you communicate those decisions. As accountants and financial professionals and business professionals more broadly, it's extremely important that you consider how you communicate of the utmost importance. Make sure your writing is clear. Make sure the way you communicate your ideas are clear. Many of us, particularly the juniors of us, have great ideas and we put them down on paper and we understand what they mean, but when you read it, it doesn't necessarily translate. So I'm going to urge you to make sure you spend a fair amount of time looking at your case, writing your case, rewriting your case, rewriting your case again, because I want to make sure that I understand all of your ideas clearly. Let's talk about the reading materials and where you would get those materials. I'm going to provide you free materials. Those materials come from the library. And when they come from the library at Rutgers University, I can send them to you with no charge. However, there are a series of articles that you will need to purchase at Harvard Business Publishing. On your screen at the moment is a link to the Harvard Business Publishing website. You will need to take the URL that I am presently highlighting on the screen and put that into your browser. That'll bring you to the Harvard Business Publishing website, and if you have not registered there, you will need to register and buy the materials. Now, if this is the first time you've gone there, great, you will need to register and provide all your credentials. If you have already registered, and I know a few of you in this class have gone to Rutgers Business School and have taken a business ethics course with me. So you might have some of these materials, but you will definitely be registered for the site. So you'll need your username and password. The cost for all the materials that I provide on the site is about $28 to $30. Now, what you might also consider is looking for these materials at the Rutgers Library. You can do that online. I check every now and then to see if some of these materials are online, and I haven't seen them recently. But I encourage you, if you're trying to save money, to do that. It might also be important for you to learn about Harvard Business Publishing, because in the past 4 years, I have been the professor who has taught you business strategy in the summer. Your 2-credit in-person course. And pretty much all of our materials in the summer come from this website. I provide you your case grades and course grades, which are one and the same. There's only one grade, as I mentioned. In the past, my business ethics classes, both at the undergraduate level and the MBA program, have averaged approximately 79 at the undergraduate level to 83, 84 at the graduate level. Class policies. Because we are not going to be here in class, there's not many of them. What you should know is that when you write your case, you need to cite all materials. You need to make sure you cite in quotes any sentence or paragraph you take directly from the materials. I use the Turnitin functionality in Blackboard to check all materials for plagiarism. So let's do each other a favor and make sure we cite everything. It's okay to take materials from other authors and to use their materials to make an argument. Just make sure we cite it. There's not going to be any acceptance of late papers for the simple notion that I have one day to get grades into Dr. Sinella and the registrar's office. So all of our papers will be due to me on the date in which we discuss. I will pick up hard copies of the papers in Newark, and I will work with your class president to figure out how to do that. And you will all send me soft copies of your case paper so I can put it into Turnitin. I'm going to also now turn to your reading materials. So for the week of January 26th, which as you know is this week, I will provide you Lecture 1. And Lecture 1 will take you through a very basic course overview. We're going to focus on the influence of business, how that influence has changed, how we are being perceived today, and then we'll jump right into the basic principles of ethics and ethics decision making, which is on your board, on your screen at the very moment. Your reading assignment is to read one article called A Note of 5 Traditional Theories of Moral Reasoning, and then a second article on moral relativism. Both of those papers are on the Harvard Business Publishing website, and they cost $4.95 a piece. As said previously, you might want to consider checking the library to see if, in fact, you can get those materials for free. Next week, which I'm hoping to have a lecture to you prior to February 2nd, but your readings for the week of February 2nd is to read a paper called The Market Failure Approach to Business Ethics, which is on Blackboard, and then to read Competing on Social Purpose and How Great Companies Think Differently. Those are 2 different articles on the Harvard Business Publishing website. Also for the week of February 2nd, you are to watch a video by Michael Porter, The Case of Letting Businesses Solve Social Problems. This is a 2013 video, but it's going to encapsulate many of the ideas and thoughts we will discuss in the course. I will also ask you the same week to watch a short video from Yvon Chouinard of Patagonia. And Yvon will talk a little bit about why he founded Patagonia, his ethics behind founding Patagonia, and his beliefs on how the company should be run. For those of you that have taken my undergraduate course in business ethics, you will find the Patagonia case to be repetitive, but once again inspirational. I can watch Yvon Chouinard 100 times, and every time I watch it, I get inspired once again. For the week of February 9th, this is the week we will start discussing professional responsibility. But before we do that, we're going to discuss something called a noxious market, as defined by Dr. Deborah Satz of Stanford University. We will discuss the concepts of justice with focus particularly on John Rawls. We will also discuss the idea of something called a nudge, which is a system or a libertarian paternal system to encourage people to make decisions based upon the wanting of the community. And as suggested, we will then jump into beginning the concepts of professional responsibility. If we go to the readings for that week, you are to read Rawls and Nozick. Both of them are on Blackboard. That is how it's saved on Blackboard, but it is a excerpt from the Stanford School or the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, and that will take you through the basic ideas of justice. During this class, we will also play a game on the Rawls, a Rawls game, which will be later defined. I have to figure out how to play this game, considering I cannot see you and you cannot see me, and we cannot discuss these ideas face to face. But hopefully I will come up with something. Next, you need to read Changing the World One Nudge at a Time and A Practitioner's Guide to Nudging, both on Blackboard. What's interesting about nudging, which I like, is for an accountant in particular, is when we're thinking through our policies and procedures for our staff and the way we think about compliance for our clients and how our clients are working with their staff. It is a very time-sensitive process. When I say time-sensitive, I mean it's a very nice way to encourage our employees to do the right thing without invading anybody's rights. And we'll talk about that more when we get there. Also on February 9th, I'm going to ask you to watch a TED Talk from Dr. Sandel, Why We Shouldn't Trust Markets with Our Civic Life. In this short video, he explains why or how we have gone from a market economy to a market society. His ideas tend to mirror those of a historical figure called Karl Polanyi, who was a socialist economist and who was also a sociologist. And he wrote in the book, The Great Transformation, how societies move from market economies to market societies, where all things come under the pressure of market behavior. And we'll unpack that video a bit on February 9th. I also asked you to, or I am asking you to watch a video from a behavioral economist. His name is Dan Ariely. Again, it's a TED Talk. He discusses our moral buggy code, and I will unpack some of his research on February 9th because it's my opinion that some of the behavioral economists are doing exceptional work in trying to teach or trying to learn how we actually make moral and ethical decisions. And then lastly, I'm going to ask you to watch Deborah Satz and her talk on the moral limits of the markets. We will unpack Dr. Satz's framework for identifying moral markets, or better still, identifying immoral markets. And it's probably, in my opinion, one of the best summaries of how we can identify immoral markets, though clearly not perfect. And then lastly, or sorry, not lastly, but on February 9th, I will provide to you the case competition materials. I think I said earlier that you'd have 1 day to complete that. I gave you a longer term assignment, so I forgot that I've actually increased the time for you, understanding the time pressures of your program. I will provide you the case on February 9th or 10th, and you will have to have that case back to me on February 18th. On February 16th or earlier, I will provide you your last lecture. That will be on professional responsibility and the AICPA and the requirements within the AICPA. I will provide you reading assignment very shortly, but at the moment I have not found the piece or pieces that I think are best suited for the professional accounting MBA program. Keep an eye out. I will be sending that material shortly. So now let's get into the first of the 4 lectures. So let's get into the first lecture. This lecture has to do with business's influence. And like I say in all my courses in ethics, that's the undergraduate level, graduate level, or training executives. There's one main ultimate goal that I hope we can think through as we engage with the materials. And that is question number 4, or on your screen, that question bolded. How can society better structure itself to get the most out of business's influence? And what I'm hoping that we can think through over time, over the next 4 weeks, and then take away with us after the course, is can we do something as business people? Now, I'm not talking about government intervention. I'm not discussing, theology or anything else. Just simply, can we in the business community do more? And you're gonna watch a video from Michael Porter next week. He's a strategy professor. I'm going to show you some other videos throughout the term. And what I'm starting to see, and I agree with, is that many of us in the business community, at least some of the forward-thinking people, are starting to ask, are the old models right? Are this idea of shareholder theory that we learn in our corporate finance course, where the professors, and I used to be one of them, so I feel free to talk about it, we think about the theory of the firm, which is to maximize shareholder value. And I'm just going to throw out the notion that possibly that's only half correct. So let's just get back to question number 4. How can society better structure itself to get the most out of its influence? We're going to talk about its influence here in a second. But in order to really get to that 4th question, I'm going to ask you over the next 20 minutes to think through how much influence does business have today? How has that changed? Is this influence good or bad for society? And once we can look at all 3 of the first 3 questions, we can start to at least begin the framework or begin thinking through what can we as business executives, you as future business executives, do to get most or to get more out of the free market, or to get more out of capitalism, or to get more out of our micro economic companies, right? To think through what can we do better for society? So on your screen, the data on here is a little outdated. I believe it's 2013 data, but it still brings home the point. Take a second and look at the data on your screen. What do you notice? Most likely you notice that these top companies, and I believe it's 11, the top 11 companies, maybe 10, top 10 companies come from China and the US. Well, that's an important piece of data. You can put that to the side. This is all in billions. So when you look at the numbers, you see that these are extremely large numbers. For instance, 16,136,000 assets, or if in billions, that would be $1 trillion. Market value, 2.3 trillion. Profits, 258 billion. And sales of 1.7 trillion. Well, there's some other dynamics to go on here, such as many of these Chinese companies are government or partially government owned. Well, we can also look at the type of company. Well, ICBC, financial services, China Construction, large construction company in China, Agricultural Bank of China, Bank, JP Morgan, Bank, Berkshire Hathaway, financial services, ExxonMobil, natural resources, GE, and the list goes on. Well, it looks like most of the wealth of these top 10, if I were to look at market value or assets, comes from natural resource companies or banks. Okay, so what this is saying is that these large institutions made up on these two particular industries or segments control a lot of wealth. Now that's important when we think about our influence. Who has influence? Well, clearly natural resource companies have influence. If we look at wealth as an influencer, banks have influence. All right, well, let's put that to the side. Let's go to the next slide. This is, again, the data's a little dated, but nonetheless, it still brings home the point, even if I updated it for current figures. What I just showed you in the past slide is $16.1 trillion of assets are owned and $258 billion of profits are generated by the top 10 global companies. That number is much larger now, but again, it's irrelevant for our discussion here. What you see in the gray box are states, nation states, the Congo, Zimbabwe, Afghanistan, Malawi, Niger, etc. And in the right-hand column, you see 2013 PPP. That represents 2013 purchasing power parity. Now, what is purchasing power parity? To hark back to your microeconomics, it's a quasi-indicator for annual salary. It's not actual salary. It's not actual compensation, but it's inflation-adjusted wages. And when you look at the Congo, inflation-adjusted wage, they come up with $394, or Afghanistan, or Madagascar, 972, or 1,072. What's the takeaway here? What do we notice about these groups of companies? Congo, Zimbabwe, Burundi, Liberia, Eritrea, Central Africa. Where are they from? Well, clearly a host of them are from the African continent, but then we see some others from the Middle East. Well, again, we look at the numbers, $394 purchasing power parity per year. And we look at this and we compare it to this slide. What do we notice? Well, they're not apples for apples, that is clear. But what we do see is extreme levels of wealth in the East and the West, China and the US. and we see, or we can jump to the conclusion that there's extreme levels of poverty in Africa and perhaps the Middle East, and perhaps other places. Well, let's keep going in this, and we'll try to see if we see something of interest. On your screen is a graph of the U.S. median household income in blue, and in the red line is the top 1% of income earners, or the super rich. And what we notice here is that the blue bar, or the blue line, is growing at a very slow rate from 1917 to 2008, whereas the red line, if I were to pull a exponential curve to that, or a linear curve, we would clearly see a much faster growth rate of the top 1% of income earners. So that's the US. I just came back from China last week, and there's a similar phenomenon occurring there. Probably even more of a stark difference than the US between the top 1% and the rest of, or the median or average household incomes. So what do we get from all of this? When I think about slide 3, slide 4, and slide 5, I get a sense of what's occurring, or at least what might appear is occurring in the free market. And I spent a fair amount of time this summer with some executives having a conversation about this. And when you think about these basic slides, we start to see some trends, rich and poor, or rich versus the poor, or the superpowers versus everybody else, or the East and the West versus the African South. Or I could have probably even extended that further, and we would see many South American countries with slightly better purchasing power parities, but not substantially better than the ones or the countries I displayed. Now, I bring this up because it's important for us in the U.S. as business executives to identify that capitalism and the free market system has not benefited everybody that participates in it equally. Now, for some of us in the class that have a little more of a libertarian perspective, or a little bit more of a laissez-faire economic perspective, they say, so what? Why should we care? Well, we should care because we are seeing more criticism of capitalism in the free markets today than probably ever before. Now, I can't empirically say yay or nay to that, but it feels that way. And I bring this up again because you, future leaders, are going to be the ones that have to deal with this issue. It's at your doorstep, or will be at your doorstep, that capitalism is not benefiting everyone equally. And perhaps equally is not the right term, but it's not benefiting everyone enough. There's clearly a group of people throughout society that are not benefiting, do not get a chance to be on that supply and demand graph. They can't buy products, and if they don't have the wealth to buy products, they can't supply products. They're lost from the market. And if they're lost from the market, then they don't care about the market. If they're not benefiting from the market, then most likely, or in many times, they will become adversaries of the market. So I'm going to, again, make a plea to you that you think about the people and the groups, the cultures, the populations that are not participating in the free market. Maybe these are minority groups. Maybe they're not minority groups. Maybe they're large populations. And ask ourselves, is there something better that we can do within the business community that helps these groups of people, yet at the same time also helps ourselves? I'll give you an example of how this might work. In my undergraduate business ethics course and in an executive program that I provide, I give a Harvard business case on a company called Veja Sneakers. Now, Veja, V-E-J-A, for those of you that want to look it up. This was a company founded by two young gentlemen out of college. And they started this company because they wanted to make attractive sneakers. They wanted to make these sneakers in an ethical fashion by not destroying the environment, yet at the same time they wanted to make a social impact. And so what they did is they opened up their manufacturing facilities in Brazil, and they hired mostly Brazilian farmers and Brazilian workers to make the sneakers and to provide all the supplies. They did this by paying higher wages. Yet in exchange for higher wages, they also charged higher prices. And when many people in society found out about Veja Sneakers and how they were making their sneakers with limited environmental damage and providing benefits to some societies that have been forgotten about, people were willing to pay more. And Veja Sneakers has been doing very well. They have been growing in the past, and they have been providing a chance for many people in the capitalist market to benefit from their efforts. And we'll come back to this a bit, but this is what I'm going to ask you to consider as we continue throughout the program. What can we do better? Now, it's important to note that I am definitely pro-markets. I typically don't tip my hand to my students too often, but I do want you to know I am a pro-markets person. I believe that had it not been for historical figures like Ford, Henry Ford, contemporary figures like Elon Musk, Steve Jobs, Bill Gates, Richard Branson, and the list goes on, we would not have the things we have today. The unbelievable levels of innovation and technology. We're saving more lives today than ever before due to the innovations in medicine. We have more entertainment and more free time than ever before. We have better travel than ever before. We have convenience that we never imagined. We have the scientific discovery happening in leaps and bounds. Artificial intelligence, blockchain technology, the combination of artificial intelligence and blockchain technology, microprocessors, nanorobotics, the list goes on. All of this because of the free markets. But we don't have to go too far. Even as pro-business people, if you are a pro-markets person, which I assume most of us in the accounting profession are, we don't have to go too far to see some of the not so good things that are occurring in the business environment. There's many states that have chosen not to engage in free markets, or if they are engaging in the free markets, they're doing it in a very regulatory manner, mainly due to cultural degradation, or how we produce or how we grow and raise animals and kill those animals. Is there a humane way to do that? Or the fair levels of pollution that are going into our skies. As I said, I was in China last week, and that is a transforming and extremely fast-growing economy where pollution is becoming an overwhelming problem for most of people in that society. Or if you go to South America and you see many of the forests being depleted at astounding rates, or some of the more uglier and darker things that happen, in capitalism that we tend to turn a blind eye to, such as sex trafficking or human slavery. Again, in my undergraduate course, I teach a case on the Carlson Company and how Carlson, as a hotel chain, knew about sex trafficking that was going through their hotels or going through hotels, and they wanted to be that one figure that did everything they could to make sure that did not occur. And they tried opening up hotels in areas, particularly in Papagayo, Costa Rica, where they were going to open a hotel in an area that was ripe for tourism, yet fraught with sex trafficking, particularly youth, teenage sex trafficking. So what did they do? They tried to solve the entire problem for the community. Those are some of the ideas that I'm thinking about in business ethics that we in the business community should also be considering. Can we solve a social problem? We solve problems all the time. We make products to solve problems. And we make products to solve wants and needs. But can we also get a little bit more serious about solving big, major social issues, such as sex trafficking, or human slavery, or deforestation, or pollution, or cultural degradation, etc., etc. On your screen here are just a couple ads that I've seen in the past that I thought were, a bit challenging. As a business ethics professor, again, you look at things a little bit differently. But the graph to the ad to the far right in green, the beer ad, was in a general magazine, Times or Newsweek magazine, where anybody of any age can pick up the magazine and look at it. Now, young children are picking up that magazine. Young children are asking their parents, what does that mean? And for most of us adults, most of us in the West, we're desensitized to this stuff. But children aren't, right? And we ask ourselves, why are we doing some of the things we're doing in society? And you don't have to go too far than seeing how businesses are selling their products. I'm not going to talk about any other ad on this page other than the Dolce & Gabbana ad in the far left, bottom left. Now, for those of you who do not know, Dolce & Gabbana sells clothes. They sell cologne, perfumes. They sell all of this type of materials. Now, Dolce & Gabbana in this ad, seems to be a little risque, but what is it really saying? Well, in many of my past classes, I'd have a group of people saying, well, they sell clothes that make women attractive to men. Maybe. But when I look at it, I think it looks like exploitation of women, or physical assault of women, or the wanting for physical assault of women. Now, I don't want to get into the sociological aspects of this stuff, but all I'm going to ask you to do is ask yourself a simple question. Can we do better? Question mark, exclamation point. Because looking back at some of the ads here and some of the things that we have done in the business community, we probably are doing things in a way many times that are unethical, are propagating bad behavior, are risque for some portions of the population are exploitative. And again, can we do better? And most of us, I think, would probably say, sure we can. We can do much better. A couple other things I want you to take note of, and I'll go through this pretty quickly, is that ethics has been impacted, particularly business ethics has been impacted by the evolution of time-space compression. What does that mean? Well, if you're not familiar with this sociological idea, what happens over time, our ability to get to places shrinks by speed. So for me to physically get from New Jersey to London today is much better than it was 100 years ago. For me to communicate today instantaneously via text message or calling someone and seeing their face via Skype has changed the way we engage or how businesses engage broadly. Now, what has occurred? If you see at the bottom, there's three things that really have changed over the past 100+ years because of this evolution of time-space compression. And we can look back even further, 5,000 years, and see with each and every innovation or technology, time and space have shrunk. Now, what has this done? Well, one, it provides us broader market access. We now have the ability to buy supply globally. That's labor supply. That can be hard goods. That can be natural resources globally in real time. And we can sell broadly in real time. We can do that maybe face-to-face. When I say face-to-face, I don't mean physically, but via Skype and other devices. We can now talk to our customers regularly. We can sell online, Amazon, Alibaba, etc. There's also broader capital market access. Now, again, looking back 120 years, even looking back 30 years, where were the capital centers? New York, London, maybe Johannesburg, maybe Hong Kong, but for the most part, it wasn't like it is today, where you can now acquire capital or seek investment globally. I spend a fair amount of time in the blockchain community, and I can tell you firsthand that the blockchain community and many of the companies selling tokens and ICOs are doing it globally in real time. Again, just supporting this idea that I can raise capital anywhere. So what has broader market access and broader capital markets done for, or what has it provided the business community? Is provided us the opportunity to make much larger companies and tackle much bigger problems, much larger problems. And, this has changed the sense that, and challenged many of the economic models that you have seen in your classes, where in the past we said there's such a thing as being too big, too large of companies. Ultimately, they stop at a point because we have diseconomies to scale. Well, that's not necessarily true any longer. Those theories are being challenged. Now, have we come to a place where companies can be extremely large and we just haven't seen how big they get before diseconomies? But this idea that we get broader access to markets and broader access to capital, and we now can expand globally, is going to continue. And we see many large companies, Google, Microsoft, Walmart. I only put on your screen here some of the software companies and telecom companies because I think it brings home the point that most often we're not competing in monopoly markets, but we're competing in oligopoly markets, extremely large companies with devastating levels of wealth and influence. And one of the underlying ideas I'm going to emphasize when we read a piece next week by Heath is that larger the companies, perhaps, in quotes, question mark, perhaps,
these larger companies are less ethical than other market structures or other companies in other market structures such as purely competitive markets. And just to refresh your memory, there's 4 market structures you've learned in your economics class: purely competitive, monopolistic, oligopolies, and monopoly markets. We're going to be spending a little bit, not much, but a little bit of time next week talking about how these market structures may have an influence on how companies compete, which ultimately have or may have an impact on how they act ethically. So is this influence good or bad for society? The answer is yes. It could be good or bad for society. And again, it's up to us, it's up to you, it's up to the future business leaders in society to think through, how can we use our influence? Can we use our influence like we have in the past 30 years, which appears as though we have focused we've focused most of our attention really on just maximizing shareholder value. Now, there's definitely companies out there that have done other things and have done great things and have been extremely ethical. But it looks like at the margin, most of our companies have been trained to maximize shareholder value. Most of our executives maximize shareholder value. And that theory has grown and has infiltrated many states. And many executives in other countries are also talking about maximizing shareholder value. Do anything you can to maximize shareholder value, but for going to jail. So if I don't go to jail, everything else is okay. Well, I'm gonna make the argument that if we don't do something, we don't do more for society. We don't provide the opportunity for the people on the margins to benefit. We're probably going to be in a different place 10, 20 years from now. As I said earlier, there's more criticism of business today than ever before. That's probably going to continue unless, of course, there is a change in the way we use our influence. Again, you're going to hear from Michael Porter next week in his video. Michael Porter is a strategy professor at Harvard Business School. He spent his entire career talking about how companies should and could maximize shareholder value through strategic positioning. But what I like about his video is even Michael is starting to recognize that companies can do more, yet at the same time also do very well financially. You're going to hear me talk about doing good and doing well simultaneously, and I think that is something that definitely can occur. So in order to understand how can societies better structure itself to get the most out of businesses' influence and power, I'm going to talk about these 4 questions very, very briefly, and then we will be done with the first section of our first lecture. So what is the purpose of business? If we were together, I would pose this question to the group: what is the purpose of business? And many times I get answers such as to make money, professor, or to maximize shareholder value, or to provide goods or services to those who need them. And all of them are right. But is there any other purpose of business? I want to think about that. Other than just providing goods and services and maximizing shareholder value and making money, what are some of the other reasons for business that you should consider? So pause for a second and think about that. So what are some of the other purposes of business? Well, not only do you want to provide goods and services. If you think about it, you don't want to just buy goods and services. You want to buy goods and services with special qualities. You want to be a high-quality product that lasts long term. You want to buy safe products. You may, I hope, want to buy products that aren't killing the environment. You want to buy products that aren't or don't have negative externalities that are hurting populations of people or damaging certain areas, and the list goes on. But what are the other purposes of business? Well, Adam Smith wrote in some of his earlier writings, yes, it's important for businesses to make money, but it's also important for businesses to provide social benefits, such as providing jobs, fair wages, providing business works in an ethical setting where they're not colluding and where businesses are doing things that help the greater community. So businesses, the purpose of business is not just to make money, but it's also to make sure that society moves forward. Society evolves in a prosperous way. Not that an individual or small group of people move forward, but society in general. Who decides the purpose of business? Again, if you were together and ask you who decides the purpose of business, many times I would hear people say, the entrepreneur that starts the company decides the purpose. It's probably right, but only partially right. For instance, if I wanted to create a time machine and I decided that a time machine is important and I want to go out and start investing in that, you're right, it's my purpose. But does that necessarily mean it's going to happen? Well, sure, I can maybe build supply and maybe invest in it. And maybe I even have something that works, or at least I think it works. But what do I need? I need a purchaser. I need someone who's going to also take the risk with me. So in order to understand who decides the purpose, I need supply, entrepreneurs. I need demand, purchasers. But I also need government to make sure that the rules are set and how we engage in that market. All right. I also need the community in which my company resides. Is that a rural community, urban community? Are there certain aspects of the community that I need to take into consideration? Are there any other groups of people that I should be considering? Or stakeholders, as we'll call them throughout this course. What about the environment? Do I need to care about the environment? How am I going to pollute the environment? Or are there other important groups that would help decide the purpose of my business? For instance, the people that I'm going to hire, are they part of a union? Do I have to take that into consideration? Are there civic groups that I have to care for? So when we think about who decides the purpose of business, yes, it's without doubt that the entrepreneur has a big say. And it's without doubt that consumers have a large say. But we cannot forget that there's a substantial number of other stakeholders that also have a say or a stake, quote unquote, in most businesses. So it's all of us that decide its purpose. How do we establish agreement? Now, I'm not going to go into detail in an online lecture, but we establish agreement between all parties. So all stakeholders should be factored into price. Supply and demand, sellers sell their product based upon price, buyers buy based upon price. But also included in that price should be the understanding that somebody's going to be paying taxes. Included in that price should be environmental cleanup, if in fact your business is going to hurt the environment. Included in that price should be to make sure that the community in which you operate benefits from your profits. So included in price should be, or should, the entrepreneur should take into consideration all stakeholders. What role does the government play? Well, this is an interesting one. Depends on your justice system or the way you look at justice. For some of us, we're going to say the government has a simple role. Lay the groundwork for rules. I tend to be in that camp. I tend to be the person that likes to know what rules I'm going to compete on, what rules the government has for my industry. I'm also under the ilk that I don't like government intervention. As long as we do not have to do it and everybody is working ethically, government shouldn't have to intervene. The unfortunate reality is there's bad actors, and there has been bad actors in the business community, and the government has had to get involved. And the government has come in and had to change the rules midstream because there are bad actors that chose, and there probably always will be, actors in the business community and any industry, any segment, including the government, that choose to abide by the letter of the law and the letter of the rules rather than the spirit of the rules. And that's important to note. We want to abide by the spirit of something rather than the written rule. Because when we abide by the written rule, many times we look for loopholes, and that creates many times the need for governments to intervene. So what role does government play? That depends on us. If we're acting ethically, the government will probably stay at arm's length. If we don't act ethically, the government will probably get involved. Now, for those of you that are familiar with the cryptocurrency marketplace or the blockchain community, also known as, we can see this occurring in real time. Here is a brand new market, the initial coin offering market, where blockchain companies are selling tokens in exchange for cash so that they can build the next generation software platforms. The government has chosen to be at an arm's length. They haven't set rules. They allowed the market to develop. Quite honestly, I think they're being very cautious. The SEC has spent little time or spent little words in clarifying their positions. The IRS has spent little time in clarifying their position. And it seems as though they're sitting back waiting to see how we behave in that community because there are no rules. Now there's starting to see there's clearly bad actors in the space. There's clearly people doing things that they shouldn't be doing. And now we're starting to see rumblings of government intervention. The SEC is now starting to take a more proactive position in the market and is starting to think about ways in which to regulate this market or put new rules or some rules to the game. The IRS has also come in and has regulated consumers and businesses, or starting to regulate consumers and businesses, because many of these actors have chosen or are thinking about not paying taxes. So the moral of the story is, if we act ethically, less government intervention. If we act unethically, more government intervention. And we'll see this in stakeholder theory and corporate social responsibility. One of the reasons for the implementation of that, or the furthering or the pushing of that ideology, is because it keeps or may keep governments at bay. And we'll come back to that. So that is the end of the introduction to the course. What I am now going to jump into is what is the purpose of morality and ethics. We are approximately 1 hour and 8 minutes into our first lecture. So I will try to go for approximately 1 more hour, and we will finish for the day and pick up next class. I did not assign anything for understanding the purposes of morality or ethics, so we will go through this as quick as I possibly can. I think it's pretty straightforward, and some of the materials that I'm going to cover you have probably read in high school, or maybe in a freshman college class, or perhaps for the literaries among you, you've read these materials for the simple notion that they are good books. So morality and ethics are interchangeable terms. In this course, we use them interchangeably. If you have taken or plan to take an ethics course, full course, you're probably going to spend a fair amount of time compartmentalizing these terms. But it is important for you to note, although we will use these interchangeably, that morals typically relate to personal actions, the do's and the don'ts of your personal actions, whereas ethics is typically related to some type of approved social action. It's a system of approved personal actions, or a system of approved personal morals, approved personal morals. So in this course, we will use these terms interchangeably, but note in an ethics course, they would probably be more compartmentalized, and our speech would be a little bit more nuanced and protected to these terms. So what is morality and ethics, and what is the purpose of morality and ethics? And I'm going to ask you to pause for a second, perhaps turn off the lecture, and spend a minute thinking about what these terms actually mean. Now that you're back from your brief pause, we're going to talk about a book many of you have read, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but I always like thinking about or bringing in literature whenever possible. For those of you that have taken my undergraduate course, this might be a refresher for you. But William Golding wrote a book called The Lord of the Flies, and I think this story tends to help us understand what is the purpose of morality and ethics, and what are morals and ethics. So let's just quickly review this story. The story is about this Lord of the Flies, also called the Evil One, and it's really about this concept of self-interest. So the story begins that there's stranded schoolboys, British schoolboys, land on an island during, I believe, World War II. We're not certain how their boat sinks, but these boys are stranded on an island. They wash up on the island. There's no adults with them. After a short point of time, these boys, very, very short period of time, set up a very rudimentary government system, and they vote for a leader. And the person that they vote for is Ralph. So Ralph works with the group to have each boys perform certain tasks, and they provide these tasks. And over time, one of the boys, Jack, chooses not to do his task of keeping a fire going so that future ships can find them, but rather chooses to go on a hunt where he is successful. And when Jack gets back from his hunt, the group tends to chastise him for letting the fire go out, despite Jack's success in the hunt. And this begins a little bit of a squabble between Jack and Ralph. Jack, who represents self-interest, no doubt about that, but in a bad context or in a corrupted context, whereas Ralph also provides a concept of self-interest, but perhaps for the good. In Jack's sense, we'll get to that in a second. But over time, Jack overthrows Ralph as the leader and removes any rules that the group previously set for themselves. The group devolves back into, or devolves into, a state of anarchy. And the Jack, as leader, and with his colleagues and friends, paint their faces, and they become hunters. And not only do they become hunters, it's also important to note that these boys are between the ages of 6 and 12 years old. So they become hunters, and they hunt animals. And as they hunt animals and they continue in this behavior, they do other things to the animals, such as they sodomize a pig, and they go back into this animal-like instinct. So over time, as Jack is the leader, he he does things. Him and his group do things. They destroy the conch, which represents a symbol of order. They kill Piggy and Simon, who are both members of Jack's group. And the story ends when Ralph and Jack are fighting, and when Ralph is about to be killed by Jack, the boys are rescued by a Navy, I believe it's a Navy captain. You know, if I think back, the Navy captain picked them up, or the way I envision it is, picked them up by the coattails, slapped them together, and said, "What are you doing? You're British school kids. We don't do this type of behavior." Meanwhile, in the background, the entire island is burning down to the ground, and all of their livelihood and all of their possibilities for success, had it not been for them being saved, would have been ruined. So what is Golding trying to communicate in this story? Well, it's so important to note that Golding wrote the book with the intent of criticizing another book called Coral Island. And Coral Island set in a similar situation, but unlike the situation in The Lord of the Flies, the boys settle and manage themselves perfectly. They're internally good. Their self-interested behaviors are all well-intended, whereas in Lord of the Flies, the self-interested behavior seems to have malintent or bad intent. So the author, Golding, is trying to take a stance that humanity is corrupt based on this concept of original sin, if you buy into that idea. In particular, people are self-interested based on the power of the individual. So in this context, Jack used his power, his self-interested power, to acquire more power. So he used his physical prowess to overtake the weaker among them in order for him and his group to survive. And Golding is trying to say that morality is weak. The morality of society is based upon the morality of the individuals in the society. So when you have ethical or individuals who have a strong ethic within a society, the society most likely will be ethical. But when people get corrupted from one reason or another, the society becomes corrupted as well. And that in order to keep the system from breaking apart or falling or devolving into something it did not intend to be, there must be rules, and those rules must be enforced. Part of the problem in Lord of the Flies was not that the group did not have rules, but the rules were unenforced. There was no ability to enforce them because Jack was a powerful individual and nobody wanted to check Jack's power. But there's also something interesting being said by Golding in the story when it relates to power as well. Even though in a society where there is no enforceability and that the individual with the most power will probably win, if we put in place some type of rules to enforce, some type of organization or institution to enforce rules, it's also possible that institution or group can become too powerful as well. So too little power in an ethical system, the ethical system breaks down. Too much power with relation to an ethical system, and the system can be corrupted. And what Golding, I think, is trying to suggest with respect to the Navy is that the Navy is a powerful force. This is the British Navy, and this is going on during the World War, suggesting that even large or even states like England that have these enforceability metrics can also become too corrupt, and society can still ultimately devolve into a state of anarchy, which one might argue was happening during the World War. There's a couple other things going on in the story with respect to death and destruction. There's two main characters in the book, Piggy and Simon. One of them represents religion and philosophy, and the other represents civilization. And like many empires and also many companies, civilization and philosophy are needed. Now, what do we mean by philosophy and religion? I'm not necessarily just talking about, Christianity or Islam or Judaism or any other religion. What we're really talking about is this quest for meaning. Why are we here? What is the purpose of life? What is the purpose of this institution? And then we have civilization. And in the context of the story, civilization was represented by technology. So a couple things are occurring here. In The Lord of the Flies, when the figure representing religion and philosophy, I just noticed on my slide here that should be Simon. When Simon is killed by Jack's group, he's figuratively saying religion and philosophy goes away. And if you remember from the story, maybe you do, maybe you don't, but Simon was always making a plea using logics of philosophy, such as give back Piggy his glasses, and then making a plea to why that was important. Once religion and philosophy goes away, civilization probably breaks down as well. And in the context of The Lord of the Flies, once Simon died, philosophy went away, argument went away, argument for the good went away, and the groups started to use technology in a very bad way. In this sense, they were using Piggy's glasses, not for good, but for bad, and in that sense, they almost burned down the entire forest. So ultimately, there's two prongs that are happening here, two prongs of thought. There's self-interest for good, and there's self-interest for bad. And ethical systems are put in place so we can maximize self-interest in a good way for the benefit of the greatest of society, or the greater of society. Here is just because I like to look at literature and then support it perhaps with other arts, here is a triptych by Horatius Bosch called The Garden of Earthly Delights. And on the far left is the Garden of Eden. And if you know the story, great. If you do not, I will articulate it very quickly for you. But here you have this figurative garden, and in this figurative garden are figures who have everything. There's humans that have everything, male and female. They have everything they possibly need, except for they are told they cannot do one thing, and that is they cannot take from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Now, what I like about this story is that it sums up self-interest. Here we have two individuals, call them Adam and Eve, that have everything they could possibly want in life, and they have a good life. But there's just one thing that they're not allowed to have. And they jeopardize everything by going for that one thing. That one extra little thing they're looking for. And so they break the rules within the garden, and they seek, or they eat the apple from the tree of the garden, from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And that enters bad behavior. That triggers a second issue, is now they're hiding from the ruler in the garden, and they do other things, and as they procreate and as they grow, the society becomes corrupted, mainly because they move away from the philosophy, and civilization starts to get corrupted. And that is in the middle panel of the triptych. Here we have society starting to break down, and into the far right is the end of, or the end of civilization, or total annihilation. And we can see this in many empires, the rise and the fall of great empires, the rise and fall of the Roman Empire, the Greek Empire, the British Empire, and maybe even Pax Americana. But here we look at another painting from Couture in the Romans and the decadence of empire. Here, once again, prior to the fall, we see, Romans moving away from philosophy of the past and rules of the past to engage in behaviors that are or were not accepted previously, and just prior to the fall. So we see throughout history that when societies choose not to have or abide by ethical systems, they will ultimately fail. Next, we move into Hobbes and his book called The Leviathan. You ask yourself, what was the purpose of Hobbes' idea of the Leviathan? And it was simply, without ethics, he suggests without ethics and the ability to enforce ethics, law and society live in a state of anarchy and competition. He calls this a state of war. And within a state of war, there's no production, no industry, no cooperation. Nothing can be produced. And it's really about survival of the fittest, more of a Nietzschean concept of the Superman, where the powerful rules, and the powerful mind, the powerful physical, etc. And when society is in a state of war, it's uncivilized, and it's really based upon this idea of survival of the fittest. This is what Hobbes refers to as the state of nature or the state of anarchy. So Hobbes suggests that there has to be an agreement or a contract within a society in order to provide a means to keep society from a state of war. And he calls this the social contract, and Hobbes argues that in order to have a productive society, society needs to give up some freedoms in exchange for protections and laws. And each member of the society gives up, a barbaric freedom such as killing, pillaging, or stealing in exchange for a rule managed by the Leviathan, who will ensure that the rule of law remains in place. By now, you probably have seen or think that the Leviathan is the government, and it probably is, or it is the government, but it can also be other bodies of quasi-government, such as the AICPA as a rule body and a rule enforcing organization, where members of the AICPA give up certain rules and rights in exchange for an ethical system that keeps or provides general benefits to all. And it's important to note that the Leviathan takes rights from all inside of a group to benefit the majority, and that by everybody giving up a little bit of their rights, in essence, we live in a more productive society. Now, I think it's also important to note that in any ethical system where we want to enforce rules and laws, there will always, I have yet to see this not be the case, but there will always be some individual or individuals who will have more rights taken from them than other groups, and it'll never be perfect. It's also important to note that the Leviathan can be corrupted, just like the Navy in the story. Too big of a Leviathan can be detrimental to society, not dissimilar from an anarchistic state, except that this time it becomes a very oppressive state. So at the heart of the idea of the Leviathan is this idea of balance between society and government, and between society and for-profit businesses, society and religion. And these are contracts that we make every day. In business community, we give up something we give up certain rights of the powerful so that we in society can agree to an ethical system. This gets us to what is this concept of morality? Well, morality is a set of rules established via the social contract. And morality and ethics is the form of social control. I remember a few weeks ago, I had a colleague say to me, well, I don't agree with any ethical systems because it's a form of social control. And I answered to them, you're absolutely right. It's a form of social control, and that's the exact reason why it's there. Some people, for some reason, think that any ethical system is oppressive or exploitative. Yes, and maybe that's true. Maybe it's not true. But as I already said to you, that some ethical systems or all ethical systems will be infringing upon somebody's rights, and sometimes, or in most times, somebody will be hurt from that system. But it's also important to note that without a morality, society and civilization break down. We've seen that throughout history. Due to the timing of the course, I can't take you through more examples, but you can seek other resources to prove me correct or wrong. All right, so why do we need morality, in particular in business? Taking into consideration Golding's general ideas in The Lord of the Flies, coupled with Leviathan and Hobbes, without an ethical system that is enforceable, we have no civilization. We live in a state of war. State of war, people are not going to abide by contracts, hence no business, because no one in business will engage in productive behavior. No business, no free markets, no advancement of technology, no advancement of society, and we move back into a state of anarchy. Okay, so I'm going to take you through the 5 purposes of morality and the 5 purposes of creating an ethical system. Again, I did not sign the reading, but there is a colleague of mine, Louis Postman, who is now deceased, and he wrote a book called The Moral Life. And in his book, The Moral Life, he identifies 5 purposes of morality or ethical systems, and they're pretty straightforward. Number 1, to keep society from falling apart. No ethical system, no community, no society. Number 2, to remove or ameliorate human suffering. That's interesting because we have ethical systems in place to make sure that not only do humans not suffer, but they flourish. So any business ethical system, if you to go to its end extent and argument, any ethical system in business should be put in place to remove suffering and to encourage flourishing. So as I showed you very early in today's lecture, there's populations of people that are not benefiting from our society or our business society, our business system. And so I ask, are we really fulfilling these 5 purposes of morality, these 5 purposes of ethical systems? There's a lot of people in pain throughout the world that capitalism and free markets can assist. And are we promoting human flourishing enough? Questions to be asked and answered by you. Number 4, ethical systems are put in place to resolve conflict of interests in a nonviolent social way. And then lastly, to assign praise and blame, reward the good and punish the guilty. So I just walked you through why we're here. Why do we need ethical systems? Well, why do we need ethical systems in the government? Why do we need ethical systems in business? And it's pretty straightforward. These 5 here, we got to ask ourselves, are the ethical systems in which we are abiding by in the business community, in the business world, globally and locally, are they doing these 5 things? In particular, are they taking away human suffering? Are they promoting flourishing? Are they helping us to resolve conflicts? And are they helping us to assign praise and blame, reward the good and punish the guilty? So that's it of part 2 of lecture number 1. I am now going to move into ethical decision making, and I'm going to focus today particularly on utilitarianism. And if I get past utilitarianism today, I will jump into deontological ethics. But based upon my timing at the moment, it looks or feels as though I will only get through utilitarianism, and I will catch up on our next lecture with respect to deontological ethics. So let's jump into the next piece. Okay, so let's begin next section of the course or of this lecture. We are now getting into decision-making theories. So how do we make a decision? Not dissimilar to how do you make a financial decision that you learned in your corporate finance class, particularly your capital budgeting lecture. But here we're now looking at how do we make a decision to make sure it's ethical. Binary. Yes, it's ethical. No, it's not ethical. Sometimes I've heard people say, well, there's grades of how ethical or unethical something is. I tend to keep my decisions pretty binary. Yes, I make the decision, it's ethical, or no, I choose not to make the decision because it's unethical. Well, I have this little creature on the screen because when I think about utilitarianism, I like to see these little guys running around, and they show their emotions pretty readily. Either they're happy or they're not happy, and very rarely do you ever see one of them in a state of no expression. So utilitarianism is a decision-making system that focuses on the happiness or the outcome or the satisfaction of the broadest of society, and I'll unpack what that means in a second. So I just quickly want you to know what is utilitarianism, what are the positive aspects, and what are the negative aspects of utilitarianism. And you want to use this, you want to reference utilitarianism or decision-making theories in your case. When you write your case, you want to explain to me why you made a decision. You want to go into detail with respect to utilitarianism. How is it used, and how did you use it to guide your decision-making principles? So 3 questions. What is utilitarianism? What are the positive aspects of it? And what are the negative aspects of it? And I'm going to just say that this is one of 2 principles we're going to learn with respect to decision-making. There are others, but for us in the business community, these 2, I believe, will get us much further in the dialogue, and will get us much further than we perhaps are today. So what is utilitarianism? Well, it's a consequential ethical theory. And now when I mean consequential ethics theory, it's based upon the consequence, or it's based upon the outcome. So utilitarianism uses outcome as a measure of something's level of ethics. So if your decision, regardless on what that decision is, but if it helps the most of society, or you get the best societal outcome, then it's a good decision. It's very similar to a cost-benefit analysis, which again you may have learned in either your management accounting course or your corporate finance course. This is exactly the kind of idea we're talking about here. Do the benefits of your decision outweigh the costs or the expenses of your decision? And if the answer is yes, then you move forward. It's measured by the level of happiness an action produces, but it also can be measured by the reduction of pain for the group or for the majority of the group. This comes from or begins with Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill, both 18th and 19th century philosophers. Bentham, later Mill, were major proponents in the way we made decision making during the colonial period. They were also one of the philosophers, or 2 of the many philosophers, that have also suggested that sometimes an ethical decision can be a decision that is counter to the law. It was one of the driving forces that drove the French and American Revolution, which was pushing the argument that it's an ethical decision to go to war because the outcome can be better for the majority of society by moving away from a monarchy, by the monarchy and that way or rule of law. So let's talk. I should have also said Both of these philosophers and quasi-politicians also argued that pleasure and pain are two sovereign masters, and that humans and individuals should only focus on these two masters. And these are based upon passions, as we'll later see. So first, what is pleasure as defined by these two individuals? It's a state of gratification or the feeling of joy. And when pleasure goes up in the society because of a decision you make, then that means that the decision is right or ethical. When they also talk about pain, and when pain goes down. So pain, first they talk about it being trouble, care, or an effort taken to accomplish something. When trouble, care, or efforts to do something go down because of a decision you make, therefore that is also an ethical decision using utilitarianism. So when we put these together, this creates a system, or what we call a hedonism system or hedonic system, and this is based upon the doctrine that pleasure or happiness is the sole or chief good in life, and that all of our decisions should be predicated on driving happiness or reduction of pain, and that nothing else matters for the most part. So all of this is based upon this concept of passions or emotions, and it's not based upon reason or the mind. In a sense, in a very vague sense, Bentham and Mill were advocating that we should focus more on our animalistic instincts of pleasure and pain and less on our cognitive or human instincts using reason or logic. Now, there's some benefits to this theory, and there's also some very ugly downsides to this theory, which we'll discuss. So when you put this together, this is for the majority of the society and not the minority. That brings up some of the ugliness of this. When it comes to the minority, let's just unpack that for a second. There have been situations in the world, and we can turn to a few of them, where a majority group thought that an action which benefited them would be best and would make them happier. And in those situations, based upon utilitarianism, that would be correct. So I tend to use ideas of Nazi Germany, for instance. And just assume my fact pattern is correct for a second. We can argue if it is or not at a later date, but assume my fact pattern is correct. And in Nazi Germany, the majority of the Nazi Germans thought that the minority Jews, homosexuals, Christians, or Catholics, all should be persecuted or killed. The majority thought that, let's assume that the majority thought that that was a good thing to do, and by killing these or persecuting these people, they would be happier. Well, based upon utilitarianism, guess what? That's an ethical decision because it's increasing the happiness or the satisfaction of those within society. Though we clearly something would bother us about making that ethical argument, so I hope. Also, we can look at a similar situation here in the United States. We don't have to go back that far to see that certain minority groups, particularly in the South, particularly the African American population, were exploited or oppressed by the white population who, if my number serves me correctly, were the majority. So we're going to exploit a minority population for the benefit of the majority. Once again, I think we can see here that this is a very oppressive and ugly standard, but based upon utilitarianism, one might be able to make a leap that that's ethical. So utilitarianism by itself is probably not the most ethical system, or let me re-clarify. Utilitarianism by itself is probably not the only standard we would look to. So we would have to look to other standards to verify that utilitarianism is right. And we'll get to that very shortly. So what do you think? Do people think in terms of pleasure and pain? I want you to take a second and think about that. Do you think only in terms of pleasure and pain? Most of us would probably say we don't think in just terms of pleasure and pain. If that were the case, would we necessarily be coming to get our MBA program in 14 months, killing ourselves, learning about all of these sometimes rigorous processes? Not sure if you guys are at advanced accounting, but you are going to find what pain really means. That is a joke, but for me, it was a very tough course. And if I were really focused only on pleasure and pain, chances of me taking advanced accounting would have probably have not been the case. But then again, that's in the short term. Some of us might say that my cost-benefit analysis is the fact that I will deal with advanced accounting or cost accounting, mainly for the sense that it'll bring me much happiness at a later date. This brings into a concept of calculation. Utilitarianism is not easily agreeable because many people will not agree on utilitarianism. Some people will have different calculations. Some will focus on the short term and some will focus on the long term. So utilitarianism as a concept is still individualistic based, just like all concepts, except that it's how an individual looks at the community. Now it's different. I'm going to urge you, it's very different than egoism or objectivism as propagated by a figure called Ayn Rand, which we will talk about probably in the next lecture. So there's two types of utilitarianism. There's something called act-based utilitarianism, and this is really suggesting what I spoke about already, is an act is right, mainly to the extent that it produces the most overall happiness or greater levels, or reduces greatest levels of pain for the majority or the group within society. But then there's also something called rule-based utilitarianism. We can also call this law-based utilitarianism, and it suggests that society must choose a set of rules that promise to result in the greatest level of happiness for the most people. All legal systems, rule-based systems, are based upon utilitarianism, if you are to think about that, because we put in rules and we put in place laws to help the majority. For instance, we just passed a tax law in the United States, and the tax law was put forward as helping the majority. But at the fringes, certain people are going to be hurt. In particular, the wealthy are going to be hurt. Possibly the wealthy are going to be hurt from this new tax plan. And I would probably argue that there's other groups of people that are going to be hurt from this tax plan. I can tell you firsthand that I am a minority group that will be hurt from this tax plan, but it was based upon increasing the happiness for the majority. It's also referred to as a welfare utilitarianism, which is increasing the wellness and the fairness of the greatest of the society. So all of our rules and legal systems are typically based upon utilitarianism. So, how is this calculated? Well, as I said earlier, everybody comes up with their own calculations, but Bentham came up with a theoretical measurement system. And he says that utilitarianism is based upon this principle of utility, which you also may remember from your microeconomics course, where your professor talked about utility, or its singular term, utils. And it's a principle which approves or disapproves of every action or decision producing benefits, advantages, pleasure, good, prevention of pain, mischief, etc., etc. So value in this system is based upon the level of pain created or the happiness eliminated. And according to Bentham, there's 7 components of value. Number 1 is intensity. When you make a decision using utilitarianism and it benefits the greatest of society, the first question or the first driver of value of that decision is based upon the intensity of the pleasure or the reduction of pain and the intensity of that. So greater the intensity, greater the value. Number two, how long is this this pleasure going to last, or this pain eliminated? That is what he refers to as duration. So if this is going to be a permanent change or a temporary change. Number three, is this certain? Is it guaranteed that I'm going to get the benefits that I believe are going to accrue to society, or the elimination of pain? If it's speculative, then the value of this decision would go down. If it's guaranteed, then the value would increase. Then how remote, how soon are we going to get this benefit? Today, tomorrow, down the road, 2 years, 50 years from now? There's also something called fecundity. Will it occur the same way in the future? So if I'm getting a benefit today from something, or I anticipate getting a benefit from my decision or an increase of happiness, will it always be the case? Or can it flip itself and get pain or reduction in happiness? Is it purity? Is it based upon purity that the probability that the opposite will occur? Now, fecundity and purity could be looked at together, and you probably want to look at them together, thinking through, will the same events or the same outcomes or the same consequences always occur? Extent, how many people are affected? Is this a big population of people, or is this a small group of people that'll be impacted from your decision? So there's the 7 components of value that drive our decision making. And as you can see here, if I were to ask a group of people to use a utilitarian system to answer an ethical dilemma, or to answer a problem, or to solve a problem, what you can see here is everybody would probably disagree. Maybe very few of us would agree on intensity, duration, certainty, etc. So it's again a principle or an argument about the community based upon an individual's preferences and passions. Okay, there's also another author. Now I assigned for you what's called the five theories of moral reasoning. It's a Harvard case, and they don't go into the level of detail I'm going in here. It just gave you an overview. So I'm going to ask you to turn to the slides and these lectures when answering the questions on your cases. So there's also another philosopher, his name is Kai Nielsen. He discusses this concept of negative responsibility with regard to utilitarianism. And what does he really mean? Well, what he says is that we have moral obligation to our non-actions in the same way that we have moral obligations to our actions. So not addressing a problem is just as important as addressing a problem. And not addressing an ethical dilemma is just important as addressing a moral obligation. And what he's saying is that sometimes hurting the innocent is necessary to bring about the most good or remove the most evil. Okay? Sometimes the innocent is the minority, based on the simple idea of utilitarianism. And he gives us a overview. He gives us an example. And again, for those of you that have taken my course in undergrad, you'll probably remember this case. It's called the case of the innocent fat man. And the way this goes is there is a very large man, Nielsen calls him a fat man, that is a skin diver or a cave diver, and he's taking a group of people on a dive. And I forget the number of people, but let's assume that there's many of these people on a dive. There's more than one. There's probably 8 or 9. And he takes them on this dive, and they dive up into a cave. And the cave is one in which will fill up at high tide and will be empty at low tide. So he takes the divers out during low tide. As he's swimming into the cave, like most tour guides, he lets all of his tourists go in front of him, and they're all in the cave, and they're all inside the cave looking at the wonders of this sea cave. Well, it was a tight opening to get into the cave, and while this cave diver, the leader of the group, is about to come into the cave, he gets stuck at the mouth of the cave. And he gets stuck to the point where he can't get out. So assume for a second he cannot get out of this gap in the cave, and he will be stuck there permanently. Well, as he's stuck in the cave, there's areas around his body where water can still seep through and come up into the mouth of the cave. And he recognizes, because he's been stuck there for a few hours now trying to wiggle his way out, and some of the tourists have also been trying to help, but there's no luck of him getting out. But what he recognizes is if he doesn't get out of this cave shortly, the tide will be coming in. And as the tide comes in, it's coming through his arms. Ultimately, he will drown, and the rest of the tourists will also drown. So that's the general setting of the case. Now, what I didn't tell you is that cave divers, you typically carry two things with them. They carry a knife or a pick, and they carry a set of dynamite, because sometimes these caves implode or fall down. So on his body is some dynamite, and the tourists can get access to this dynamite. So you can see where I'm going here. What do we do? Well, according to Nielsen, first, the fat man should do something, because he should consider blowing himself up for the greater good. Now, most of us probably watching this lecture would have a tough time blowing ourselves up in order to save others. Well, that's exactly what Nielsen is saying, is that we have responsibility to our non-actions as we do to our actions. So if he chooses not to do something, he is responsible for the other people in the cave. But we might even be able to take this a step further, and by saying perhaps if the diver doesn't want to do something, there's also the other people in the group who have to do something, and maybe they have to take it upon themselves to blow up the diver. Now, a couple of you are probably saying, I would not do that, and that's understandable. Now, we probably can't understand why you wouldn't do it just yet, but many of you are going to say, I cannot take the life of someone else, and maybe that's true. But what, again, Nielsen is trying to say here, and the inherent argument of utilitarianism, is that it's for the greatest number or the greatest good. So this concept of negative responsibility suggests that the diver should take his own life, and if he cannot take his own life, then those within the group should take his life for him to save the majority. So what's going on here? First, he's saying it's not wrong to kill the fat man. It would be wrong to evade a decision, because what he was also suggesting is that most people would not be able to come to a decision to either do it or not to do it, and therefore people would die out of lack of decision. So he looks at the morality or the immorality of the decision to kill versus the immorality of the decision to kill plus of evasiveness, which is worse. So do I kill, which is bad, or do I kill, or do I not kill, but be evasive, and that kills people, and that's even worse decision. So he's going with the fact that it's better to kill for the majority than not do anything and the majority dies. There's multiple other examples of how this can be used. I'll take you through two, and then we will be almost done for the day. There's a train example, and the train example goes something like this. There's also sometimes called the trolley example, and everybody has different tweaks to this example, but here's mine. There is an overpass, and this overpass walks over a train line, and the train line where this overpass is about 100 yards from the train station. So it's very close to the train station, and the people on the overpass are probably coming or going to the train station. And you can hear loudspeakers and you get in the back and you can hear them say, train 105 leaving or train 105 coming. So you're standing on the overpass taking a break from the day, and it's just you there. And what you also notice is there's a fragile old homeless person in the corner. And you hear